So I've literally just done a video on free speech, and so I wanted to come on here and talk about the backlash that an artist is receiving for chanting death, death to the IDF at the Glastonbury Festival. So I'll briefly summarize what happened and then I'll move on to answering or exploring 4 questions. Okay, so basically at this year's Glastonbury Festival, Bobby Vylan, who is an artist, the frontman of a punk rap duo called Bob Vylan, never heard of this people before, never heard of this person before. So he sparked a massive controversy when he led the crowd in chants of free, free Palestine, which then escalated to shouting death to the IDF, referring to Israel's defense forces. The BBC, broadcasting the performance live, they kept this rolling, so they kept the feed rolling. And that decision itself has sparked other outrage from politicians, Jewish groups, and the public who see it as dangerous incitement of hatred and potential violence, not just against Israel's soldiers, but potentially against Jewish communities worldwide. More on that later. But Bobby Vylan, the artist who was screaming all this, he remains, defiant, insisting that he said what he said. Okay, so number 1, is calling for the death to a modern military considered political protest or criminal incitement? Did the BBC fail in its real-time responsibility to prevent the spread of hate speech? Where is the line between artistic expression and violence supporting rhetoric, especially on large public stages like Glastonbury? And the last question I want to explore is, what are the broader implications for artists taking strong stances on international conflicts? Okay, so firstly, calling for death to military forces, political protest or criminal incitement? And let's take this apart. Chanting death to the IDF, I don't think this can just be seen as political opinion or protest, especially in our day and age. In today's climate, these leftist mobs, they routinely blur the lines between Israel and Jews, Zionism and Jews. So this chant is actually quite dangerous. These are not just words. Radical Islamists and the far left are not simply expressing an opinion. They're stoking a hatred that leads to real violence. We've seen this time and time again. So we're not talking about someone saying, oh, I disagree with Israeli policy. This is an explicit call for death. It's an incitement to violence against an identifiable group. But in saying all that, I do think we do have to distinguish between what people ought to be allowed to say and what is wise and moral to say. So that's the classical liberal perspective. And they would say that the law shouldn't really criminalize speech simply because it's shocking or offensive or even vile. And some would argue that death to the IDF is an expression of political opinion, however vile, and its hyperbolic rhetoric is simply directed at an institution. So in terms of legality, I guess we are either committed to free speech, including speech we hate, or we're not committed to it at all. And once we criminalize political slogans, even abhorrent ones, then we're kind of inviting the government to define which opinions are lawful, and that could be a path to tyranny. So there's different angles. So I guess the crucial question is whether this speech crosses the legal threshold of incitement to violence. And under UK and US law, that bar is extremely high, and it typically requires a direct call to imminent violent action. It can be argued that this was a vague crowd chant and it doesn't really reach that bar. Otherwise, we are inviting the state to police every intemperate outburst at a protest or a gig. So maybe free speech does have to include the freedom to be an idiot. I don't know. Now, the next question, did the BBC fail in its real-time responsibility to prevent the spread of hate speech? I say yes, they did. And this wasn't an accident because the BBC is ideologically captured. Imagine for a single moment a Glastonbury performer getting on stage and shouting death to Palestinians, even death to Hamas. I bet you the BBC will cut the feed so fast. Why? Because the entire BBC's cultural class is steeped in leftist assumptions that because Palestinians, they are eternal victims because they're apparently non-white, and Israelis are eternal oppressors, and all the moral weight belongs to one side. So the BBC didn't cut the feed because deep down, a significant chunk of its staff sympathize with the message, or at minimum believe it's, a complex issue worth airing. That's why they hesitated. That's why they issued soft disclaimers instead of cutting it. And as always, the BBC failed in its duty not only as a broadcaster, but as a national institution meant to preserve social cohesion and public order. They platformed open calls for violence, so they bear responsibility for giving it legitimacy. Now, where is the line between artistic expression and violent support in rhetoric, especially on large public spaces like Glastonbury? I think artists are not isolated individuals screaming into a void. They have platforms, audiences, influence. So when this Bobby Vylan guy, even though I don't know him, but he has followers, he has an audience. Artists should be free to express themselves, yes, but audiences and organizers have the equal right to condemn them, cancel bookings, or refuse to platform them. That's the free market of ideas in action. Artistic expression shouldn't shield you from any social or reputational consequences, and it doesn't. The deeper cultural problem here is that modern progressive circles excuse radical speech as noble if it's aimed at the powerful. That's why death to the IDF is framed as activism by some rather than violent rhetoric. That's a dangerous double standards because you are dealing with actual people and actual human beings and not abstract ideas. And the problem is that modern art culture has become a space for radical leftism and anti-Western sentiment. So artists like Bobby Vylan, they get to play the role as revolutionaries cloaked in a language of resistance while spewing rhetoric that inflames hatred and violence. And I think it's a fair and reasonable consequence that his US visa has been revoked and people are distancing themselves from this kind of message and rhetoric. He absolutely has the right to say what he said, but he should be judged harshly for saying it. So what are the broader implications for artists taking strong stances on international conflicts? Artists who inject themselves into international conflicts have some responsibility. Again, artists are not just some random people with opinions. They have influence, massive or not, they have influence, and they help normalize ideas. Artists bear responsibility if they become propagandists for movements whose end goal is the eradication of the Jewish state. And one thing I want to make clear is that we're seeing a fusion between radical leftist activism and violent Islamist ideology. And artists, through their ignorance or ideological zeal, are becoming vehicles for this. We can't keep pretending it's just art. No, it's propaganda. These things shape public opinion, embolden extremists. As an artist, once you take a side, you risk becoming a mouthpiece for movements or regimes whose values are profoundly illiberal. Look at the radical pro-Palestinian activists who fly Hamas flags or Hezbollah flags. Too often, leftist artists indulge in radical rhetoric without considering that they're actually legitimizing groups far more violent and authoritarian than the states they're claiming to criticize. They are literally allowing themselves to be useful idiots for causes utterly, completely incompatible with the freedoms they claim to champion. So, Bobby Vylan's chants are a dangerous incitement, and the BBC's failures reflect deep ideological rot. The line between art and incitement must be enforced with real consequences, and artists need to understand that aligning with radical anti-Israel rhetoric is aligning with forces deeply hostile to the West and to liberal democracy itself. Let me know what you think about this. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you made it this far, please subscribe, and if you'd like to support this channel and these conversations and my voice, the link is in the description, and that's the way that you can support me there. See you soon.